Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week, I'm very excited to sit down with Kirsten Delegard, the co-founder of the Mapping Prejudice Project at the University of Minnesota, to talk about her work and how it relates to the series of articles on the Jewish departure from North Minneapolis running on TC Jewfolk. We talk about how the project got started, her family connection to restricted covenants in Minneapolis, and what she hopes people take away from the whole project on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Kirsten Delegard, co-founder of the Mapping Prejudice Project. Welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I've been really looking forward to talking to you. First, I don't feel the need to butter up my guest all, but right from the top. But if people haven't checked out the Mapping Prejudice website, it's mappingprejudice.org. It is a fantastic project that you helped start at the University of Minnesota. I guess for starters, what led you down this road with creating this? I guess starting in 2016.
Yeah. Well, I would rewind a little bit before 2016, of course. Yeah. I mean, I would say what launched Mapping Prejudice was really this question that I had, which was, I'm a Minneapolis native. I grew up in Minneapolis. I would say sort of in what I'm going to call the salad years of Minneapolis, the Mary Tyler Moore years of Minneapolis, when, Minneapolis is on national television as this model metropolis. There's just, if you look back on the press that Minneapolis got in the 1970s, so this is my childhood, everyone holds it up as this wonder of this urban miracle in a lot of ways. And that's what I was fed growing up. But like a lot of young Minnesotans, when I was 18, I'm like, I'm getting out of here and I'm never coming back because, I'm going to go to more interesting places that have real problems, right? And so I left and I went to school on the East Coast. I married a guy from New York, and I figured that sealed the deal that I would never, ever come back to Minneapolis. We went and lived a bunch of different places, including North Carolina. And then when I had my daughter, I suddenly turned to my husband and said, we have to live in Minneapolis. I have to raise my kids as Minnesotans. And he was like, you could have mentioned this to me at some point. Sorry, I'm giving you the long response here. And I think this is a very common story for a lot of Minnesotans, that we leave and then we come back. So I ended up dragging my husband and my two kids back here after 20 years, and I had all these new lenses to see my hometown with at that point. So I had all this training as a historian, and so here's to give you like the real deep backstory. My husband is a journalist, and he said, okay, fine. I'll be a Minnesotan. Our kids can be Minnesotans. But if you're going to, if we're going to live in Minneapolis, I better understand the history of this place. If I'm going to be writing. And I said, oh yeah, no problem. I will. He was like, so you got to get me like the big, the main books on the history of Minneapolis. And so I was like, yeah, I can do a lit review for you, no problem. And I went looking, and what I discovered is that there had been like no synthetic history written of Minneapolis since 1941. And I was just astonished that it's such a interesting city. And the more I dug into it, the more interesting the history was, that there had been no, very little actually was written about Minneapolis. And so that was like the first piece. And then the more I reintegrated my professional life back into my new home, I really realized there was this major dissonance, which was this myth that I had been raised with about Minneapolis growing up, and then the reality of living in Minneapolis in the early 21st century, which is that Minneapolis is a great place to live if you're white, and it's a terrible place to live if you're a person of color. How did that happen in a city that was so proud of bringing to a national stage politicians who actually made their careers as civil rights activists? So that was basically like that question is what has driven Mapping Prejudice. So I was intrigued by that question. I did a lot of archival research on on that. And I really didn't want to just have that conversation in a traditional way with a certain small number of scholars. I wanted to really engage as many Minneapolitans and Minnesotans as possible in that question. And that was what led me to corral my colleagues into creating a project that used primary sources to provoke new realizations about the past, and getting people to really engage actively with the visualization of structural racism in Minneapolis. And that's what Mapping Prejudice says.
It's interesting because obviously this project has been around for several years now. And as we're talking here in early September, we are 3.5 months after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And the idea of structural racism in the city of Minneapolis, I think for most people, they were awakened to that fact on Memorial Day this year. And in the protests and everything that took place in the aftermath of it. But obviously your research and all of the work you've put in shows that it's actually been happening for a century or more.
Yeah.
How, I guess, before getting into the, how, because I don't know if we can actually get into the how this happened, but I guess, how did people react when you first sort of held this mirror in front of them of, hey guys, we're not all that great?
Yeah. It depends on who you are, right? So, when we started doing this work, so the premise of Mapping Prejudice is that we've used digital tools to comb through the millions and millions of property records in Hennepin County and now in Ramsey County, and we're expanding from there, to identify the records that have this racist language. So racial covenants, which say this piece of land can never be occupied by someone who's defined as not white. And we can get into that whole question. And then we put that up we use computers to narrow those documents down. We put it on a crowdsourcing platform, and then we have regular people read those documents, right? And the way people react to that really depends on what their personal experience is, what their family experience is. So for a lot of, like you said, for a lot of white Minnesotans, a lot of white Minneapolitans, there's this shock and horror when they encounter those documents. They say, I never knew. I had no idea. I never knew. So at first I found that reaction to be somewhat gratifying. Like as a teacher, I'm like, great, like I've taught people something that they didn't know. But after a while, I have to say, like the more I heard that, the more frustrated I got, because the more you know about this history, the more you realize there's nothing secret about this. Like there are literally hundreds of books that have been written about this. There's movies, there's poetry, there's artwork, there's Supreme Court cases, there's newspaper coverage. Which explains why when Black people read those same documents and they have their own family experience, there's one of two reactions. One is for young people especially, they say, my mom and my grandma always told me about these things. I never believed, I didn't know what they were talking about. So for like the younger generation, it's validating to some degree. I would say for older people, a lot of times they react. Sometimes they say, well, thank you for validating, my experience. But sometimes they are really angry. They're like, yeah, I could have told you this. Why are you doing all this research on something that my family has known?
Right.
And we've been talking about, we've been dealing with this for decades. And it's very logical that these are the reactions that I would have gotten, but it wasn't quite what I expected as a white person, coming into this work. I expected there to be more sort of angry white people being like, oh, you're just making this up. We really don't get much of that. And
that surprises me. I kind of thought you would get more of that. I thought that when I sort of asked the question, I expected that to be the answer, but I'm glad at least it wasn't.
And a couple times when we're like, okay, that's fine. Why don't you just open up this platform and you can read some deeds and documents and then just tell us what you think. Like if you think we're making it up. And it's kind of, that's the power of these documents, is that they are really hard to misrepresent or misunderstand.
Oh, for sure. It's hard to look away from. It's hard. Again, I think anybody who denies it after looking at the documents clearly they either didn't really read it or they just see what they want to see in it.
Yeah, we haven't actually had anyone.
That's good.
Yeah, because you can. Yeah, or maybe they, I'm preaching to the choir. But yeah. There are people who will say, why are you stirring up the pot? This has been illegal since 1968. What difference does it make? Why don't we don't need to know about this history. We just gotta focus on the present. Like, this has been illegal. You're just, dredging up old stuff.
I think you could also, come back with the question of why was it, why did it take until 68 for it to become illegal?
Yes.
Who thought it was okay before that?
Right. And yes, there's that. Yeah. And actually, and then, yes, then there's there's many responses to that.
Certainly. But it's, it's interesting because I think the more all of us, not just, me personally, but I think at least a lot of people who have, wanted to read more and learn more about people of color, especially in the Twin Cities, especially in the wake of George Floyd. I think, that might be the first introduction, the George Floyd might have been the first introduction to a lot of people about what systemic racism really means. And, I don't think a lot of people think of it this way, but, where you have like generational wealth comes from owning real estate and being able to pass that on. And so many people of color who were restricted from that in those deeds for, generations don't get the same opportunities. And this is how you have the disparities that Minnesota, unfortunately, is known for.
Right. Notorious.
Yeah.
As I say. Yeah. This is where I always use my own family history to illustrate, which is that my grandparents were new Americans. They were immigrants, and they certainly came from, they didn't start life, let's put it this way, with a lot of advantages, either in the way of education or wealth. And, two of my grandparents were orphaned at early ages, and, they were really on their own from the time they were very young. But even though they were new Americans, they were seen as white. So both sets of my grandparents were able to buy houses in Minneapolis near Lake Nokomis in 1942. And they both bought houses in areas that were blanketed by racial covenants. My paternal grandparents, they had a racial covenant on their house. And those areas of the city have appreciated, the real estate has appreciated there at a greater rate than certainly than areas that didn't have racial covenants. In the case of my father's parents, my grandfather lived in the same house until the 1980s. And when he died, our family sold the house and distributed the profits to all the grandchildren. And that's the capital that I was able to use to put a down payment on my house in South Minneapolis, which I could not otherwise have afforded on my generous historian salary. But I had that. And that's how intergenerational wealth is built, right? And that's how you end up with a 10-to-1 racial wealth gap in the United States. And so we start with racial covenants in terms of the work that we do, the presentation, and I draw a direct line from that to this racial wealth gap, to these disparities. But the racial wealth gap, it's directly linked to these restrictions on housing, right? It's 10-to-1, and most white Americans, A, don't believe there is a racial wealth gap, and B, have no idea that it's 10-to-1.
I had no idea that it was 10-to-1. I knew there was a gap, but and the gap it feels obvious if you're just paying attention to what's going on around you. But at that number, that is, I mean, it's shocking is the only word, right?
Yeah.
It's I mean, appalling also, I think, works.
Yeah.
But, this is, becomes the root of so many of the challenges, I think, that we face as a country right now, that have been dredged up. I mean, George Floyd being killed had nothing, I mean, I say it had nothing to do with it. This was going on before him, and it has gone on since.
Yeah. But hopefully people are seeing it through a new frame now.
Yeah.
Right. So these police killings, obviously, they've been going on. I mean, there's a whole database. The Star Tribune created a whole database of police killings. This is not a secret,
no,
right? Yeah.
Right.
But I mean, just here, not to mention across the country, but I hope that people are now seeing it as not one bad actor, right? But seeing it as a product of these structures.
Yeah.
And I feel like, we have to give props to the activists who have been working in this realm, that people, when they went out on the streets after Memorial Day, I think people had some new frames to understand this violence through. And, in these very, very, very challenging times, I think that's what gives me hope that there have been some narrative shifts, right?
Kirsten and I are going to talk about the Jewish community and its connection to racial covenants and redlining after this message from our sponsor this week, Milovitz, Gallup, and Milovitz.
I am Alan Milovitz, and I have been helping injury victims for over 30 years. If you have been a victim of an injury or accident, don't sign anything until you have spoken to an attorney. You could be signing away your right to fair compensation. If you have been injured, call us. We want to help. We will make a time to talk about your case. You can reach Milovitz, Gallup, and Milovitz at 763-560-0000. That's 763-560-0000.
I hope so. I would think and hope that that's the case. Part of this, yes, this is our regular Monday podcast, but the timing of being able to talk to you is great. We are in the middle of the series that you have spoken with one of our regular contributors, Lev Gringos, for, that he has spearheaded this very lengthy 4-part series on sort of the Jewish departure from North Minneapolis. And, I think, as I had heard the story, there were, and reading Lev stuff before publication, really sort of a slap in the face a bit to me in terms of, my preconceived notions, that, as I had heard the stories, Jews were as affected by redlining as African Americans and people of color. And it turns out that that's not exactly the story.
No, that's right.
And that was shocking. I really thought that, we sort of, as the stories were, I had heard them, we were sort of all in it together. And it turns out not exactly the case. And that's sort of part of what you've, part of what has come out of your research.
Yeah. I mean, so I was talking about like people's reactions to the covenants and people's reactions to Mapping Prejudice. And the reason I know about racial covenants is because of Minneapolis Jews in my life who told me about racial covenants. So the Jewish community in Minneapolis, which of course was known as the anti-Semitism capital of the United States in the 1940s, it has a long dark history, let's put it that way, with anti-Semitism. I fully expected to see that anti-Semitism articulated in these racial covenants. And that's what everyone told me I would find. And so when we started looking at the documents and found that actually only 1% of the covenants that we identified named Jews specifically. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but that 100% of the covenants named Black people. That it was clear that this was not so straightforward. It wasn't like Jews and Blacks were equally targeted by this. Our project was shocked. The team was shocked to find that. And so I'll let you ask more questions. I dive into this.
No, dive away. Because I do think it's interesting because, again, I like I said, as I'd heard the stories, it was, I'm not going to say it was, maybe the Jews were, like, again, I heard it from other Jews. I didn't know, it wasn't that we were placing ourselves in, in that boat necessarily. It just sort of, that was just the narrative. And it makes me wonder where the idea of that narrative came from in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, and I don't mean to, I don't want to discount or to, what's the word? I mean, I think some of that idea that we were all in this, it comes from a place of social solidarity. It's it's a positive thing, right? Yeah. It's this sense of empathy, and that's really important. And that it's a recognition that Jews and Blacks did live on the near North Side together, and we're equally, we're both considered not desirable neighbors, let's put it that way, by a lot of white Minneapolitans. So, and North High School was Jews and Blacks, right? And so that's a real recognition of of history. But then it gets more complicated because Jews have always been conditionally white, right? And so sometimes Jews are seen as white, and obviously Jews are not a monolithic group either. You have German Jews, you have Eastern European Jews, you have Jews of color. It's like, right. So it's not. And that, that's always been going on in terms of who can pass for white and who can't pass for white. And so all that was in play when the Jewish community organized in 1919 to get a law passed in Minnesota that made it illegal to discriminate in real estate transactions on the basis of religion. And so it was at that moment where you have that specific language that referenced people of the Semitic race or Jews that drops out of the covenants, and the language then starts moving more towards where it ends up after World War II, only people of the Caucasian race, right? Yeah. And so that's like who's Caucasian, who's white, who's not white, and the way people saw that, there was no, because race is a construct, right? Yep. So who gets to be white in different situations changes over time.
Absolutely. And it does sort of get to, the age-old, question of is Judaism a race or is it a religion?
Right. Yeah. Right. And So
and for purposes of real estate in 1919, it got us off the hook. Although, interestingly, it never changed the anti-Semitic nature of Minneapolis. Right. Just meant we could buy houses. Right. It didn't mean we were liked anymore.
Right, exactly. And that's the thing. Like, in no way in finding this research, I've been super careful to say, this in no way negates these experiences of anti-Semitism and violence and hatred, and in no way says like anti-Semitism is not real or that it's not a really central pillar to white nationalism, which is very real. Like you cannot separate those two out, right?
No, absolutely.
And so so when we are talking about this, we are very careful to make that clear. But but it's important to recognize that housing is a really important thing. So if you can if you have access to capital and if you have access to stable, affordable housing, it changes everything in your life. And so that was an avenue that was open to Jews who were seen as white, that was not open to people who were seen as Black. And that's a key difference. And I think perhaps some of the tension, especially since the Fair Housing Act or since the 50s and 60s in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, has been around that very question. Is that Jews keep saying, wait, we're in this together. And Black people are like, yeah, no, we're not.
Right.
that we are actually not, because you could leave North Minneapolis and move to St. Louis Park, which was covered with racial covenants, and we couldn't.
Right.
And so that means that your families were able to invest in these in these houses and pass that wealth down, and everything that comes with it, from
Right.
access to education to access to more capital. And in fact, we have examples of Jewish developers who are putting the racial covenants into properties, and we have a rabbi's house that has a racial covenant on it, and so it's just a more complex story. And I there's no question that there's some people who are like, yeah, we Jew, so seeing some of the language, we Jews, we are white, just in case, we just go to temple, we're just like you, we just go to temple. It's just so it's this very complicated story, right?
You're saying race and religion are complicated?
They're complicated, believe it or not.
Who'd have thought?
Who would have thought it? Yeah. Yeah. And yeah. And yet you have, and none of this negates the fact that you have the Klan, is incredibly strong and the silver shirts are incredibly strong, and they're targeting blacks and Jews at the same time, but in very different ways.
Right.
Right.
Right. And it's interesting. I've talked to, a couple different people for stories for the series. And, I think back to my own, lived experience. I'm from Detroit originally and was not born until the mid 70s, but, lived in Detroit for a few years. And then when my family was able, we moved out to the suburbs. We left Detroit. White flight was a real thing. People moving from the city into sort of those first and second ring suburbs from the city, and beyond, and even moving further outside away from the city. And and it's other people I've talked to, happened to them in the cities they grew up to. They saw it happening also. So I don't know about the covenants necessarily, and obviously your research does not necessarily extend nationwide, but in terms, some of that struggle seems to have happened. I mean, it goes beyond Minneapolis, though.
Oh yeah. This is a story you could tell about any city, and to some degree, the people who are moving out of North Minneapolis in the 50s, well, they're just making a rational decision. They want a 2-car garage. They want a kitchen with new appliances. They want great financing terms. It's cheaper to move into a Rambler in St. Louis Park than to try to renovate your old duplex that you're sharing with grandma and grandpa on the north side. So it's a perfectly rational, understandable. It's not so much of like, oh, we got to get out of this neighborhood, it's dangerous and we don't like it.
Right.
As much as it's like, we want each of the kids to have a bedroom, and and I want a new refrigerator, and it's a utterly rational decision that people made. Sure. And they were able to make it, and it was actually, everything was pushing them towards that, because that's where the cheap financing was. The new construction, it's much cheaper to own a new house than to. I own a house from 1922. I can tell you it's not always the best financial decision to buy an old house. So
it looks really nice,
yeah,
but I mean, that's the thing. Upkeep, maintenance, that kind of thing on an older house it's a different challenge.
Yes.
Certainly. Yeah. So you've been sort of doing the Jewish community speaker circuit a little bit lately. Yeah. Spoke to the Cardozo Society event, which I heard was very well attended, and it sounded like people could have kept you there for at least a couple extra hours asking questions.
It was a good group.
It was about this work, and did a JCRC, part of their living room learning series back in August. What, when you're having these kinds of conversations with Jewish groups like this, and or at least predominantly Jewish groups, how's the message received, especially based on what's gone on since late May?
I've been very grateful at how open people are, because this is to some degree, like, I feel like it's not a third rail of Minnesota history, but it's pretty close in the sense of like this is pretty central to community identity, and people have been very generous with us, I would say, in terms of listening to what we're saying. And and we've had some kind of nutty, and I'm not saying at these particular events where people are but we've gotten some emails, let's put it that way. Some of the angriest emails that we've gotten have been from people in the Jewish community who feel that we collectively as a project are negating some central truths that they hold. And people have told me that people have accused me of actually going to the property records office and whiting out Jews out of their property record, out of their covenants, because they knew it was there before, but when I showed them the record and I say it's not there, they said, well, I know it was there. You must have taken it out. You must have altered the record, which I think is a really interesting, like it speaks to that power of community belief, right? And that people feel very threatened at this idea. And I think it really speaks in some ways to this, some really basic American ideas about merit, or like that we live in a meritocracy, that things are deserved, and it's this it's this narrative of overcoming, right, great challenges, and that is that Jews face these great challenges and they overcame this incredible discrimination, and therefore it's possible for anyone in the American context to do the same thing. I think that's part of it, and part of it is like a personal thing. So, but I really, it's also, that's why I've been trying to nuance this message as much as possible to say, look, I'm not saying, like, I'm the first to say that, we're in a period of incredible intensifying anti-Semitism, and the last thing I want to do is to whitewash any of that, or to underplay any of that. In fact, I think we should be thinking about that more and understanding that more and really confronting that, because I think we're in a period where people are, basically denying anti-Semitism, denying the Holocaust. But at the same time, we have to have a better, if we're going to move forward in real solidarity against white nationalism and against white supremacy, we're going to have an honest accounting of the way race worked in our communities. And so that's kind of and I've been really grateful to people like Laura Zell in the Jewish Community Relations Council, who sat down with me and really dug into this and really worked, because our Robin Dorr show at the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest. I mean, early on when I started finding these things, these are friends of mine, and I sat down, I went to them and I was like, look, this is what I'm finding. I need your help, to make sure that that we're not creating more divisions, I guess, in that we use this to create more understanding.
Yeah. And I think that's I think it's an important, what I hope people take away from the series that we're putting out there. It's I think it's hard in a story like this where you have this struggle of obvious evil things that are being done. You don't want to think of yourself on the side of evil. You want to think of yourself as an ally. And I think it's hard because you read the story and you look at the history and you see, man, maybe we don't get to be the hero this time, do we? And it doesn't mean we're the villain, but it also, it's to use a lot of the language that's being used right now. I've never thought I was racist, but it wasn't until recently that I understood that I wasn't necessarily being anti-racist either, and what that meant. And that's some powerful humility to try to sit there and learn that. So I kind of hope that, that's mean, I don't expect everybody's going to love what we have to say and what we have to put out there, but it doesn't mean it's not important in the greater narrative of what's happening right now to our community and to other marginalized communities. It's hard.
Yeah. And I try to offer, I think humility is that is absolutely the most important thing right now, and I try to offer my own family story, I guess, as an example, that here I am, I'm standing up here talking about this racist history and saying, look, I am fully implicated in this. My family, I have profited directly from these racist documents that brought more wealth to my family, which I have benefited from, and my kids benefit from today. Am I a bad person? Like I would say my grandparents were not bad people. My parents are not, that's not the point. That is not the point. The point is that we all have to be first of all, aware of these structures. White people have to shed this fake innocence, that we have about this. Pay attention, open your eyes. It's not rocket science here. And then we have to do something about it, it's, and that's where the real, instead of, sort of hand wringing, I don't know. I mean, I think it's just really important for all of us. And it's not like a Maoist self-correction thing that I'm looking for, so, but it's just being truthful, because otherwise for people of color, it's like gaslighting all the time. Like, no, that didn't happen. Not real kind of thing. So.
Or, it's not as bad as you thought it was, or it's not as bad as it seemed, or you get to acknowledge that maybe something was going on, but it couldn't have, the downstream effects can't be as bad as everybody's saying.
Yeah. Or you've had time to get over that by now, right? Right. It's been 50 years since the Fair Housing Act was passed and then never enforced. Or never acted on after it was passed.
It's hardly the point, though. They passed the law. That's enough. Yeah,
that's enough. So, So I think that's that it's an ugly, where it's an ugly history. We're all implicated in, and I think, and I think that's the humility is the key, like you said.
So, a quick question about your own, like you said, your own grandparents' history. How did you find out that their house was under a restrictive covenant? When did you come across that?
It was early on when we started doing,
okay.
When we started doing, I mean, I always had this sort of theoretical idea. I was like, I'm going to like marry my personal and like my perfect. And then I was like, oh, okay. I'm really gonna, because I started looking at the map as our data was coming in, and I was like, wait, that's my grandparents' house. That's where I used to go every weekend to hang out with my grandparents. And then I started thinking back on all the stories that my parents would talk about the neighborhood. My father in particular talks about the neighborhood where he was raised as being one of the best places in the world that he could have ever grown up. And he's, I get a lot of my love of my hometown from my parents, who, have a lot of good reasons to love this place. But, my dad always talked about, he was right near Lake Nokomis. He went swimming in the summer. He went skating in the winter. His father didn't make it to 8th grade because he was orphaned when he was 7 years old. And my father graduated from the University of Minnesota, so there were solid schools. And he was like, I could live at home and go to a Big Ten university and get a degree, and and he said, my mom got rid of me, first thing in the morning, she said, you have to get out of the house. And I wasn't allowed to come back until dinner. He could just roam around the neighborhood perfectly,
Right.
And so it's all that, thinking about all that, and thinking about the fact that it was legally off limits to anyone who was not white. And then, so I mean, So it was very early on, and then I started, that. So, and I hope that by telling my own story that I can help other people do this, see their own connection, see themselves in this map, and see, oh, my grandparents lived in this house, this part of town where it was redlined. And, that explains a lot about why my parents struggled maybe, or why. And thinking about, what did your school look like when you were growing up? What did the local park look like?
Yeah.
So
it's a lot to think about. It's a lot to wrestle with. And that's, I think, it gets, not to say everybody, but I think certainly a lot of people are trying to wrestle with that. And how do we do better by our neighbors? And, you can't change the history, but you can certainly, learn and accept.
Yeah. That's a start, right? Yeah.
Feels like the very base level.
Yeah, but you know what?
Do.
But white Americans have not even been willing to do that.
No.
But I think, I hope this is where this research and this project and this community engagement is helpful, in the sense that there's a lot of great solutions out there. You know, when people despair, you just have to look to the people who've been doing the work in the trenches. I'm going to point to like Jewish Community Action.
Yes.
Great, organized,
great
fantastic,
people. Yep.
Great people. If you talk to Dave Schneider, he will give you 10 policy things that you can do right now, that we could do right now that would make a huge difference in people's lives.
Yeah.
So these are not unsolvable problems. We just have to have the political will to support them. And we're never going to have the political will unless we first acknowledge what happened, right? Because otherwise people just say, oh, well, it's just natural. That's just the way it's meant to be. That's how people are. We made this. We can unmake it. And I hope that's what this history can help people get to.
So as you learn this history, did your husband regret the move?
We could call him in and he can he can ask. He's been directing the coverage at he's the city editor at the Star Tribune and so he's been rather busy the last
I would
months.
Say it's been quite a few months for him.
Yes, and he's had to do it all from our walk-in closet in our bedroom. He hasn't always been happy with me, let's put it that way. but I don't think he can blame all this on me. So no. It's he sometimes in March he says, do we have to live in Minneapolis forever? So, but in general, I would say he has bloomed well where rooted. So he has become a Minneapolitan in a lot of ways.
Good. He doesn't hold the history you uncovered against you then.
Well, he himself has written a book on Minneapolis history now, King of Skid Row, about the Gateway District in downtown Minneapolis. That can be another podcast episode.
I would love to. I will have to read it and then talk to him about that.
It's a great book. He's a great storyteller. Lots of amazing history there. So. Yes. Well,
excellent. Thank you for the plug of his book. All right, last two questions. We're going to go on a very light note. This is going to be a full 180. What is your favorite Jewish food?
Oh, latkes. That's easy.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wasting no time. Okay.
Yeah, no. Latkes. Yes. That's our favorite Hanukkah book in our family is latkes. What is it? Cook me up a Hanukkah treat. So, and I have learned to make a fluffy, delicious latke over the last 20 years. I'm very proud of it.
That's excellent. And what's your favorite Jewish holiday?
Oh, Passover.
Okay. How come?
Yeah, so I just love the storytelling. I love the food piece of it. I have always loved Passover. I love sitting around a table and debating the questions and talking about the meaning of the story and how every year it has new meaning. The story does.
Oh, so. Absolutely. And hopefully by next year's we can all sit around a table together and
yes, please.
knock on wood. Kirsten Delegard, thank you so much for joining us this week. This is not always the most uplifting topic, but certainly important and instructional as we all try to figure out how to do better and move forward in this unprecedented time.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jewfolk Podcast Network, a product of Jewfolk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.